My name is Rachel. I am 42 years old, and I live in a quiet Midwestern town where every face is familiar and every secret feels heavier because everyone eventually knows. I own a boutique on Main Street, a small shop with creaking wooden floors and sunlight spilling through lace curtains. For me, fabric has never been just fabric. It is memory, promise, and devotion stitched together with every needle prick. That devotion was nowhere clearer than in the gown I had been working on for 7 long months. 7 months of evenings hunched over my sewing table of carefully threading pearls one by one until they shimmered like captured fireflies. It was for my daughter Emma. She is 18, bold and radiant, the kind of girl who can walk into any room and make the atmosphere shift without saying a word. This gown was my tribute to her crown for graduation day, a symbol that she deserved to shine in a world that had often tried to dim her. But on that morning, when the sun should have felt like hope, I walked into my back room and froze. The mannequin stood bare slashed fabric pooling around its feet. The gown was in pieces, ribbons of ivory and lace shredded into fragments that littered the floor. Pearls I'd sewn with patient care rolled into the cracks of the wood like tiny mocking tears. I bent down and touched one scrap, and the weight of it crushed me. It felt like someone had reached inside my chest and ripped out the heartbeat itself. My throat closed. For a moment, all I could hear was the buzzing of cicadas outside the window and the hollow sound of my own breath breaking. Then came the sting of realization. This was no accident. Dresses do not shred themselves. The violence of the cuts, the way the seams had been deliberately yanked apart, it was intentional. And instantly I knew, because this was not the first time my daughter had been targeted. The air in that room changed. The smell of torn silk clung in my nose. My hands trembled not only because my work was destroyed, but because the cruel message was so clear Emma would not be allowed to shine on her day. It was a message meant to crush, to remind us of our place to strip away joy with one brutal act. I sank to my knees among the wreckage, my palms flattening against the ruined train of the dress. 1,000 memories of Emma flashed her laughter at the kitchen table, her head bent over sketchbooks, her dreams of leaving this town and carving her own path. Every moment had built toward this ceremony, and now it was shattered. But as my tears threatened to fall, another feeling rose to the surface. Anger, hot and sharp, coursed through me. Whoever thought they could break us with this act underestimated both me and my daughter. Still fear whispered in my ear. Fear that Emma would step into that back room, see the ruin, and think she was not worthy of celebration. Fear that she would believe the lie that her joy could be taken from her as easily as a dress can be cut apart. That was the moment I made a silent vow, right there on the floor, surrounded by wreckage. I would not let this act define Emma's day. I would not let her feel small, not even for a heartbeat. This was the opening shot in a battle, and I would answer it with everything I had left. I stood brushing the dust and threads from my hands. My heart pounded like a drum, equal parts grief and determination. The gown may have been torn to shreds, but the story was far from over. In fact, this was only the beginning. And if you are listening right now, you need to know the moments that try to break us are often the very moments that awaken our fire. This was mine. Before I tell you what happened next, let me ask, have you ever been in a moment where someone tried to strip away the thing that mattered most to you? If you know that feeling, share it in the comments below. And if you want to walk with me through the rest of this story, make sure you subscribe so you never miss the truth I am about to unfold. Because what happened next will prove that even when they try to tear you apart, you can always rise stronger. I did not need a detective to tell me who had done it. The fabric was ripped with precision, not by accident, not by careless hands. It was done by someone who wanted Emma to walk on to that graduation stage humiliated. Someone who believed she did not deserve to shine. And in my world, that someone had one name. Her name was Margaret, my mother-in-law. From the very day I married, Daniel Margaret made it clear that Emma and I would never belong in her definition of family. Daniel's first wife, who had passed away when Emma was just a toddler, was Margaret's saint, her golden child. I was the interloper, the woman who had dared to step into shoes she thought could never be filled. And my daughter, my Emma, the girl who had done nothing but dream and work hard, was a constant reminder that life had moved forward without Margaret's approval. Every look, every comment, every carefully staged accident had carried that message. To Margaret, Emma was not real family. She was the outsider's child. There had been the time Emma's art portfolio, something she had poured months of work into, was mysteriously splattered with paint the night before a school exhibition. Margaret had been the only visitor in the house that afternoon. Another year, the phone call that supposedly came from me to cancel Emma's art show entry turned out to be Margaret pretending to be me. She always laughed it off, always tilted her head with false innocence, claiming it was just a misunderstanding. And Daniel, my husband, bless him, had smoothed things over each time. He is a good man, hard-working, generous, but when it comes to his mother, he is blind. He has lived his whole life under her guilt trips, her tears, her endless manipulation. To him, confronting her would mean confronting years of loyalty and shame. So instead, he swallowed her excuses, and in doing so, left me and Emma unprotected. But this shredded gown was no misunderstanding. It was an act of war. I could almost see Margaret's face in my mind, her tight smile as she dropped off old fabric scraps at the shop the day before. Her eyes sharp, searching for weakness. She had been waiting for me to stumble, and when she could not find a stumble, she created one. I gripped the ruined lace in my hand and whispered to the empty room, "You will not win." Because Margaret thought she had broken us. She thought by destroying the gown she had destroyed Emma's moment. But she had underestimated me. She had underestimated the bond between a mother and daughter, who had already walked through storms far darker than this. I pulled out my phone and dialed Tessa, my best friend. My voice cracked as I explained, but her response was immediate, steady, and fierce. "Rachel, that's vandalism. You should call the police." I shook my head, though she could not see me. "And what will they do? Margaret will deny it. Daniel will plead for peace. It will be my word against hers. No, the law will not save Emma's day. I will." Even as I said it, the weight of fear pressed against my ribs. Tomorrow was graduation. Tomorrow, Emma would stand before hundreds of people to receive recognition for years of hard work. Straight A's art awards, her speech as one of the top students. She had earned every second of that moment. And I would not allow Margaret's cruelty to take it away. That thought steadied me. It gave me clarity. Margaret could destroy one gown, but she could not destroy Emma. And neither could she destroy me. This was the moment I understood something every parent eventually learns. Protecting your child is not just about shielding them from harm. It is about showing them that no matter who tries to silence them, their worth is unshakable. Margaret had just reminded me of that truth. So I lifted my head, wiped my eyes, and began to plan. So, before we go any further, I want to pause for a moment and ask you something. Have you ever had someone in your life who smiled to your face while working in the shadows to tear you down? If you have, leave a comment below because your story matters too. And if you want to keep walking through this battle with me, make sure you hit subscribe, because the next turn in this story is not one you want to miss. Because the fight was only beginning. The truth about Margaret's hostility did not start with that shredded gown. It stretched back over years like a poisonous vine creeping slowly around every corner of our lives. And if I am going to tell you this story honestly, you need to understand how deep her resentment went, because the gown was not her first strike. It was simply her boldest. I still remember the night Emma was 12. She had spent months crafting her art portfolio. Every page held hours of drawings, watercolors, sketches she had created late at night under the dim light of her desk lamp. That portfolio was her pride. On the eve of her school exhibition, I left it on the dining table so we would not forget to bring it. When we woke the next morning, the pages were ruined, paint splattered across them as if a can had tipped. The strange thing was we had not left paint anywhere near the dining room. But Margaret had visited the evening before, bringing over cookies and smiling too sweetly. She was the only person who had been there. Emma cried herself to sleep that night, and I sat by her bed stroking her hair, whispering that accidents happen. But in my heart I knew It had not been an accident. The following year, Emma signed up for an art show. She was ecstatic until the teacher told her she had been withdrawn from the event. Supposedly, I had called the school to cancel, except I never made that call. Later whispers reached me that someone had imitated my voice, and again, the only person with both the motive and the audacity was Margaret. It was always like that. Small acts of sabotage perfectly timed to wound. A forgotten phone message about a club meeting. A cutting remark said loud enough for Emma to hear Daniel deserves a real family, not someone else's baggage. Each time Margaret disguised cruelty with plausible deniability, leaving us trapped between suspicion and silence. Daniel's reaction was always the same. He would sigh, run his hands through his hair, and say, "Rachel, she does not mean it. She is just set in her ways." He wanted to believe his mother's intentions were harmless, that her heart was too soft to inflict real damage. But Emma and I knew better. We felt it in every bruise that never showed on skin, but lived in memory. And yet, even knowing her history, the sight of the ruined gown took my breath away. It was not just the destruction of fabric. It was the culmination of years of contempt finally given form. I told myself again, Emma will not pay the price for Margaret's bitterness. My mind replayed every insult, every sabotage, and with each memory resolve hardened inside me. This time I would not brush it off. This time I would not allow Daniel to soothe it away with excuses. The gown may have been torn apart, but Margaret had made one miscalculation. She believed Emma had no defense, no shield. She thought this was the final word. But I had been preparing for this moment longer than Margaret could ever imagine. Because when you live with someone constantly trying to dim your child's light, you learn to expect the storm. You learn to sew not only fabric, but backup plans. You learn to turn love into strategy. That night, as I sat in my workshop, surrounded by scraps, I realized that the battle had shifted. Margaret had escalated her cruelty. Now I would escalate my response. And before I share with you what I decided to do next, I want to hear from you. Have you ever seen someone sabotage another person quietly, in ways small enough to deny, but cruel enough to wound? If that resonates, write it in the comments. Your stories matter here. And if you are walking with me through this storm, subscribe, because what comes next will show that preparation can turn sabotage into triumph. This was not the end. It was the beginning of my counter move. The night after the gown was destroyed, I sat alone in my workshop. The pieces of silk and lace still lay on the floor, scattered like bones of a dream that had been killed too soon. I picked up a pearl and rolled it between my fingers. It had once been part of a pattern meant to shine under stage lights. Now, it was nothing more than a reminder of cruelty. The weight of it pressed on me. Not just the work lost, but the meaning behind it. That gown had been my way of telling Emma, "You are worthy, you belong, you are loved." 7 months of sleepless nights, of bleeding fingers, of whispered prayers into fabric, all of it had been poured into that dress. To see it torn apart was like watching my daughter's worth ripped away before her eyes. I imagined her reaction if she saw it. The heartbreak, the way her shoulders would slump, the spark in her eyes dimming. That thought shook me harder than anything else. The gown was gone, yes, but worse than that, the moment it represented had been threatened. And I knew Margaret wanted exactly that. She wanted Emma to feel small. For a brief moment, despair took over. My chest felt tight, and fear whispered in my ear. Tomorrow was the ceremony. Hundreds of people would be watching. Emma would stand among her peers, some of them with families cheering loudly, waving cameras, holding flowers. How could I let her stand there with nothing? How could I let Margaret's cruelty define what was supposed to be Emma's proudest day? I buried my face in my hands. "Please," I whispered into the silence. "Do not let her suffer for this." Then something inside me shifted. A flicker of defiance broke through the fog. Because if Margaret thought she could tear us down with scissors and spite, she was mistaken. She could shred fabric, but she could not shred Emma's spirit unless I let her. That was when resolve settled over me. I would not allow my daughter to walk into that gymnasium feeling defeated. If I had to stay up all night creating something new, I would. If I had to stand at the ceremony holding her hand while the world stared, I would. Margaret had taken her best shot, but she had underestimated me. I pushed the scraps aside and rose to my feet. The destruction on the floor no longer looked like an ending, it looked like a challenge. The longer I stared at the wreckage, the clearer it became. Margaret had wanted to control the story to make Emma's day about humiliation. But the truth is, I had a choice. I could let this broken fabric define the ending, or I could rewrite the narrative. And deep down I knew I had already taken the first step toward that rewrite. I had done something long ago after Margaret ruined Emma's art portfolio, a secret plan, a backup. I had not known if I would ever need it, but I had done it anyway because living under Margaret's shadow meant expecting sabotage. That memory began to surface as I stood there surrounded by the wreckage. It whispered to me like a lifeline urging me to remember. I did not smile yet. I was not ready. But for the first time since walking into that room, I felt something stronger than despair. Hope. The pieces of the ruined gown still lay scattered, but they no longer owned me. They were only fabric. What mattered was what Emma would wear tomorrow and what message she would carry with her onto that stage. Margaret thought she had stolen our story. She was wrong. I need to pause here and ask you, my listener. Have you ever faced a moment where it felt like everything you had built was torn apart right before the finish line? How did you respond? Share it below, because others need to hear your strength. And stay with me, subscribe, if you have not already, because the turn in this story will prove that preparation is sometimes the sharpest weapon against betrayal. Tomorrow would not be Margaret's victory, it would be Emma's. I had nearly forgotten about it. The memory sat quietly at the back of my mind until that night when despair began to press too hard on my chest. And then like a spark in the dark, it returned. The backup dress. Almost a year earlier, after Margaret had sabotaged Emma's portfolio, I had started to expect that she would strike again. I told myself I was being paranoid. Daniel even laughed at me gently when I stayed late at the boutique saying I worked too much. But deep down, I knew. You do not live through years of sabotage without learning to anticipate storms. So in secret, I had stitched together a second gown, one no one knew about. I had hidden it behind old prom dresses at the back of the storage closet. An emerald green gown cut to catch the light in ways that made it shimmer like a forest under moonlight. Beads traced its bodice in patterns that danced when touched. It was bold, striking, and utterly unlike the ivory gown I had spent 7 months creating. It was in truth more Emma than anything else I had ever sewn. I remember pulling the garment bag into my hands, my fingers trembling as I unzipped it. The fabric slipped out in a cascade of green, and for the first time that night, my lips curved into a smile. I whispered almost to myself, "She is going to shine." I snapped a photo of it and sent it to Tessa, my closest friend, the one person who had known every storm I had faced. She called back immediately, "Rachel, it is stunning. She will love it. Margaret thinks she won, but she is about to see how wrong she is." Her words steadied me, because it was not just about saving a dress. It was about reclaiming the story, about refusing to let cruelty have the final word. Of course, a part of me worried. What if Emma did not like it? What if she felt betrayed because I had made a backup without telling her I had hidden it? Not to keep secrets from her, but because I wanted her to have the original gown, the one we had planned together. Now fate had decided differently. And there was another truth: Margaret would be at the ceremony. She would stand there in her pearl necklace and practiced smile, watching for any flicker of humiliation on Emma's face. She would be ready to smirk, ready to whisper her victory to anyone who would listen. I clenched the emerald fabric in my hands and said aloud, "Let her come. She thinks she has broken us, but she is about to watch us rise." For the first time all day, I felt control returning to me. The shredded ivory gown was not the end of the story. It was the setup for something even stronger. The green gown was not just a replacement. It was a declaration. Margaret could tear apart fabric, but she could not tear apart resilience. Still, I kept the secret a little longer. Emma had not yet seen the destruction in the back room. She was still at rehearsal, blissfully unaware of the storm waiting for her. My heart clenched at the thought of her walking through the door, her joy colliding with devastation. I tucked the emerald gown back behind the curtain, ready for the moment she would need it most. So, that night as I lay in bed, I thought about the strange irony. Margaret had forced me to reveal something I had created out of love and fear years earlier. She thought she had stolen Emma's glory. Instead, she had unlocked a weapon we never intended to use. And now let me ask you before I move forward. Have you ever created a plan B in your life, something you never expected to use, but that one day saved you? If you have, tell me in the comments because people need to know how foresight can change everything. And if you want to hear how Emma reacted when she saw the gown, make sure you subscribe. Because that moment is one I will never forget. Margaret had no idea. Tomorrow she would see Emma shine brighter than ever. The front bell of the boutique jingled just as I was sliding the emerald gown back behind the curtain. My heart leapt into my throat. Emma's voice floated through the shop light and breathless from rehearsal. "Mom, I am back." For a split second I considered blocking her path, steering her away from the back room, keeping the wreckage hidden. But it was too late. She stepped inside, her eyes bright with excitement, only for them to land on the floor, where shredded ivory fabric and pearls lay scattered like ashes. The change in her face broke me. The light dimmed in an instant. Her lips parted, her breath hitched. "Mom," she whispered, her voice trembling as she took in the ruin what happened to my dress. I crossed the room in 2 strides and pulled her into my arms. She was shaking, her frame rigid as she buried her face against my shoulder. My throat closed, but I forced myself to answer. It was Margaret. Her whole body stiffened. She pulled back, tears burning her eyes. Of course it was her. She has hated me since the beginning. She finally found a way to ruin everything. The pain in her words cut deep. This was exactly what I had feared, that Emma would feel the cruelty, not just as an attack on fabric, but as an attack on her worth. I cupped her face in my hands and whispered, "Listen to me. She has not won, not even close." Emma blinked at me through her tears. "But the ceremony is tomorrow. What am I supposed to wear? Everyone will be looking at me. I cannot stand on that stage in rags." That was when I reached for the curtain. My hand no longer trembled. Slowly, deliberately, I pulled the garment bag into the light. "Margaret thinks she knows us," I said, my voice steady now, "but she has no idea what we are capable of." I unzipped the bag, and emerald fabric spilled out, catching the soft light of the boutique. Emma gasped. The sadness melted from her eyes, replaced by wonder. She reached out her fingers, brushing the beaded patterns, as though they were fragile jewels. "Mom, you made this for me." Tears welled in my eyes, but this time they were not from grief. I nodded. "I made it because I knew one day we might need it. And because you deserve to shine no matter what anyone tries to take from you." Emma pressed the gown to her chest, her lips curving into a shaky smile. For the first time that day, I saw her hope return. Her eyes gleamed, no longer dulled by Margaret's cruelty. She looked at me, her voice soft but fierce. "Then let her watch me wear this tomorrow. Let her see she cannot break us." I pulled her into my arms again, and this time the hug was different. No longer desperate, no longer drowning in despair. It was a vow shared between mother and daughter we would not be broken. That night, as we carefully hung the emerald gown on Emma's door, I realized something. The ivory dress had been beautiful, but this one, this green, defiant creation, carried a power the other never could. It was born from betrayal, but it glowed with resilience. And when Emma stepped onto that stage tomorrow, she would not just be graduating. She would be declaring victory. Before I go on, I want to ask you something important. If you had been Emma, if someone had destroyed the symbol of your hard work right before your big day, how would you have reacted? Would you have given up, or would you have found another way to rise? Share your thoughts in the comments because your perspective could help someone else find strength. And if this story is pulling at your heart, subscribe now because the next part will show how even the blindest loyalty can begin to crack. Margaret thought she had stolen Emma's moment. She had only sharpened it. The next morning, the house was filled with quiet tension. Sunlight filtered through Emma's window, painting golden stripes across her walls. The emerald gown hung on the door, glowing like it had a life of its own. I sat behind her, curling her hair strand by strand, watching her reflection in the mirror. For the first time in months, she looked older, steadier, like someone who had walked through fire and refused to be burned. Daniel poked his head into the room. His eyes landed on the emerald dress, and confusion spread across his face. "That is not the gown you showed me last week," he said carefully. His voice was hesitant, almost defensive, as if he already feared the answer. I kept my focus on the curling iron. "You should ask your mother about that," I replied evenly. He frowned, shifting uncomfortably. "Rachel, she would not do something like that, would she?" I met his gaze in the mirror. My voice was steady, stripped of any softness. 7 months of work, Daniel, gone in minutes. The pieces are still lying on my workroom floor if you want to see them. He opened his mouth, but before he could answer, Emma spoke. Her voice was quiet, but it carried a sharp edge. "Dad, it is not the first time. Remember my art portfolio, the one she ruined the night before my exhibition, or when she called the school pretending to be mom to cancel my entry? You know, it has always been her." Daniel froze, his hands clenched at his sides. I could see the gears turning in his head, decades of excuses grinding against undeniable truth. He wanted to defend his mother, but the evidence was too heavy now. For once he had no words. I turned back to Emma, brushing a curl off her shoulder. "Today is not about her. Today is about you." Emma nodded, her jaw firm, then let her see me shine. Those words filled the room like a command. They reminded me why I had fought so hard, why I had prepared that backup gown, why I had refused to bow under Margaret's cruelty. Because Emma deserved to rise above it all, not with anger, not with bitterness, but with brilliance that could not be dimmed. As I zipped the emerald gown onto her frame, I whispered, "No one can take away your light." Emma turned to me, her eyes fierce. "Then let's prove it." The drive to the school felt different than I expected. I thought I would be nervous, but instead I felt something stronger. Calm determination. Margaret would be there. She would see the emerald gown. She would feel the sting of her failure in front of every watching eye. And most importantly, Emma would not carry shame into that auditorium. She would carry victory. In that moment, I realized this was bigger than a graduation ceremony. It was about more than grades, speeches, and gowns. It was about showing Emma that she had the right to claim space in the world, no matter who tried to push her out. It was about teaching her through action that strength is not about avoiding battles. It is about standing tall when the battle comes to your door. Margaret wanted to write the story, but we were about to take the pen back. So, I want to pause here and ask you something. Have you ever had to tell someone you love that they are stronger than the lies others throw at them? Have you had to look them in the eyes and remind them that their worth cannot be stolen? If so, share it in the comments, because that act of courage, speaking truth into someone's life, can change everything. And if you are walking with me through this storm, subscribe, because the next part will show what happens when Emma steps into the spotlight and Margaret realizes she has lost control. The gown was ready, Emma was ready, and so was I. The school parking lot buzzed with families in their best clothes, the kind of nervous excitement that makes the air feel charged. Children carried bouquets, parents clutched cameras, grandparents shuffled proudly toward the entrance. And then there was us, Emma, stepping out of the car in her emerald gown, the morning sun catching every bead so that it shimmered like it was alive. Heads turned instantly, conversations stalled. For a moment, she was the only person anyone saw. I felt pride surge through me so powerfully it almost hurt. She was radiant, but I knew what was coming. Margaret was here too. I spotted her near the entrance, standing with George, her husband. Her lips were tight. Her chin raised the same air of superiority she always carried. But when her eyes fell on Emma's gown, her face twisted. Shock first, then rage. She grabbed Daniel's arm so hard he winced. "That is not the dress you showed me," she hissed. I smiled. "No, it is not. Someone destroyed that dress yesterday, with a key only family members have." I made sure my voice carried just enough for nearby parents to hear. Murmurs spread quickly. Margaret's face flushed red. George turned to her, confused. "Destroyed with a key." I held his gaze, still smiling. "Yes, not broken into, not stolen. Someone used a key." Then softer, I added, "Right, Margaret." She stammered, but before she could recover, The principal called everyone inside. The timing was perfect. She was left fuming, her excuses unsaid, while Emma walked past, her head held high gown, glittering like defiance itself. Inside the gymnasium, the air buzzed with anticipation. Families found their seats, the stage lights warmed to a glow, and graduates lined up in their robes. But Emma stood apart, not just because of her gown, but because of the confidence in her shoulders, the way she carried herself. She was not broken. She was unshaken. Daniel sat beside me, his silence heavy. His jaw was clenched, his eyes fixed on his daughter. For years he had looked away, convincing himself his mother was harmless. But now, confronted with the sight of Emma shining, despite Margaret's sabotage, he could not hide from the truth. He saw it, and he knew. I leaned closer to him and whispered, "Do you understand now?" He said nothing, but his hand tightened around mine. It was the first crack in the armor of denial Margaret had wrapped around him for decades. And while I watched my husband wrestle with truth, I felt a strange calm. For the first time, Margaret did not matter. Her schemes, her rage, her control. It all felt small compared to the power of this moment. Emma was glowing under the lights, and no one could take that away. What? But still the story was not finished. Margaret had not yet felt the full weight of the truth. That moment was coming, and I knew when it arrived, everything in our family would change forever. And before I tell you what happened on that stage, I need to pause. Because this is the moment where you and I connect. Have you ever seen someone try to steal joy from another, only to watch that joy blaze even brighter? If you have, tell me in the comments. Your words can remind others that resilience shines louder than sabotage. And if you are feeling the pull of this story, subscribe now, because what happens when Emma takes the microphone will shake the very foundation of Margaret's control. Emma was about to speak, and Margaret was about to lose everything. The lights dimmed slightly as the ceremony began. The gymnasium was filled with parents holding their breath, teachers lined up in rows, and graduates shifting nervously in their seats. The principal gave the opening remarks, her voice echoing through the speakers. But my eyes were only on Emma. She sat tall, the emerald gown glowing like it was alive under the stage lights. Every head in the room seemed drawn to her. Margaret sat a few rows ahead of us, stiff as a statue, her hands clutching her purse so tightly her knuckles turned white. I knew she was boiling inside, watching Emma shine brighter than ever. When Emma's name was called as one of the speakers, the room shifted. A hush fell. She rose, her notes in hand, and walked toward the podium. Her gown caught the light, shimmering with every step like resilience woven into fabric. She looked untouchable. I glanced at Daniel. His eyes were wet. For years he had dismissed what Margaret did, brushing it aside as quirks or misunderstandings. But in that moment, he saw the cost. He saw his daughter walk into the fire and refuse to burn. Emma placed her notes on the podium, adjusted the microphone, and then lifted her head. Her voice was steady, calm, and full of something deeper than pride. "Life is not about the people who try to hold you back," she began. Her words echoed across the gym. "It is about how you keep moving forward. Sometimes the ones who should lift you up are the ones who push you down. But strength is not just standing tall. Strength is getting back up every single time." The room was silent. Parents leaned forward, students stilled, and I felt the weight of every year Margaret had tried to diminish her. Emma was speaking not only to the audience, but directly to her grandmother, and everyone knew it. She continued, her voice unwavering. "I have learned that no one can take away your worth. They can tear what you have built. They can try to erase your work, but they cannot touch who you are. That is yours to keep." I looked at Margaret. Her face was pale, frozen, as if every word was aimed like an arrow at her chest. She could not hide. The entire gym knew. Daniel wiped his cheeks, his breath shaky. I squeezed his hand, and for the first time he did not pull away. He was beginning to understand. When Emma finished, the applause erupted. The sound was deafening, parents rising to their feet, clapping and cheering. It was more than applause for a speech. It was recognition of strength. It was defiance against cruelty. Emma stepped down from the podium, glowing. She walked back to her seat with a calm grace, her head high. Margaret sat rigid, the applause crashing around her like waves against a rock. She could not stop it. She could not rewrite it. Emma had taken the microphone and rewritten the story in front of everyone. And I knew then Margaret's grip was breaking. Emma had spoken her truth. Now it was time for Margaret to face hers. The applause still rang in my ears as Emma glided back to her seat, her emerald gown catching the light with every step. It was the kind of moment that etches itself into memory forever. She had spoken with grace and fire, and the audience had responded with thunder. But the storm was not over yet because Margaret was still sitting there, and her silence was louder than the cheers. As families began to whisper, I watched Margaret's face tighten. She leaned toward Daniel, her voice low but sharp, though I caught enough to know the tone. Excuses, deflections. She was already spinning a story to cover herself, to paint herself as the victim. It was the same pattern I had seen for years: deny, manipulate, twist. But this time was different. The crowd had heard Emma. They had felt the truth in her words. Margaret could try to rewrite reality, but the evidence was already in the open, shining in emerald green. After the ceremony ended, the graduates began to gather outside for photos. Families clustered in groups, hugging, laughing, posing with cameras. Emma stood among her classmates, smiling brighter than I had ever seen her. She was free. Then Margaret approached. Her smile was tight, brittle, and her voice sugary, sweet. "Emma, you looked nice up there." The words were hollow, strained. I stepped forward before Emma had to answer. My voice was calm, but each syllable carried steel. "Margaret, we need to talk about yesterday." Her eyes flicked to me, narrowing. "Yesterday." I reached into my bag and pulled out a small leather-bound journal. I opened it deliberately, the pages filled with years of notes, dates, incidents carefully recorded. March 2 years ago, I read aloud. Emma's art portfolio destroyed the night before her exhibition. June last year, phone call to the school posing as me to cancel Emma's art show entry. There are witnesses, even photos. The color drained from Margaret's face. George, her husband, leaned closer, his expression hardening as he scanned the pages. "You kept a record?" he asked, disbelief heavy in his voice. "Every single time," I said firmly, because I knew one day we would need proof. Daniel reached for the journal, his hands trembling as he read. His face shifted, shock, then anger, then something like grief. He looked up at his mother. "How could you?" His voice cracked. "She is my daughter as much as anyone could be." Margaret's mask slipped. Her voice rose sharp with venom. "She is not your real daughter." Daniel flinched as if struck. Then, for the first time in years, his voice thundered louder than hers. "She is more my family than you are right now." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Parents nearby turned, their expressions curious, some judgmental, others sympathetic. Margaret froze, her mouth opening and closing, but no defense came. She had lost control of the story. George straightened his eyes hard. "Margaret, did you really tell Emma's art teacher she was unreliable just to keep her out of the showcase?" Margaret stammered, but the truth was already carved into her silence. In that moment, Daniel extended his hand. "Give me your key. You are not welcome in our home until you face what you have done." His hand trembled, but his voice did not. Margaret's face twisted, fury and fear mixing. She hesitated, then slowly reached into her purse. The jingling of keys as she dropped them into Daniel's palm was the sound of her control breaking. Before I move forward, I want to ask you something. Have you ever stood in public, finally speaking the truth to someone who has denied it for years? Have you felt the relief of no longer being silent? Share that moment in the comments because your courage could inspire someone else to break free. And subscribe now because what George uncovered after this confrontation would twist the story in a way none of us saw coming. The facade had cracked, but the real collapse was yet to come. The sound of keys clinking in Daniel's palm was like a bell ringing in a courtroom. It marked the verdict. Margaret had been exposed, her power finally slipping through her fingers. Yet the day was far from over. Family still gathered in the parking lot, graduates laughing, cameras flashing. For Emma, this was supposed to be a celebration, not a battlefield. And I was determined to give her that. Emma's classmates rushed over, hugging her, snapping photos, complimenting the emerald gown. She smiled with a grace that stunned me. She did not let Margaret's drama steal even a fraction of her joy. And then something extraordinary happened. Parents I barely knew walked up to me shaking my hand, whispering words, like your daughter's speech moved me, or she's stronger than most adults I know. Every word was a tiny victory proof that Emma's light had not been dimmed but magnified. I glanced at Margaret. She stood off to the side, stiff, her smile forced. For years she had orchestrated shadows around Emma, but now she was watching her granddaughter celebrated openly without her control. Her face was pale, her eyes darting, calculating. She had lost, and she knew it. But Emma was not finished. She spotted Margaret watching and walked toward her, shoulders squared, eyes fierce. For a moment I feared the confrontation might shatter the fragile peace of the day. But Emma stopped just short, raised her chin and said calmly, "You can tear fabric, but you cannot tear me. You tried, and I am still here." The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret blinked, her mouth opening as if to reply, but nothing came. For the first time she looked powerless before the very girl she had spent years trying to diminish. Daniel stepped up beside Emma, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder. His voice carried for everyone nearby to hear, "She is my daughter. That is final." It was a public declaration, one Margaret could not erase. The murmurs of approval from onlookers sealed it further. Her reign of quiet sabotage was finished. Emma turned back to the crowd as if the confrontation had never happened. She laughed with her friends, posed for pictures, even pulled Daniel into one. Her arms wrapped around him like she was claiming him back as her father in front of the whole world. My heart swelled at the sight. Years of tension, of trying to prove her worth, had culminated in this moment. Emma, radiant, Daniel, finally standing tall beside her, and Margaret shrinking into the background. But just when I thought the story had reached its close, George, my father-in-law, stepped forward. His face was grave, his voice low. "Rachel, Daniel," he said, "we need to talk." There was something in his tone that made my stomach clench. He looked at Margaret, then back at us. "There are things you do not know. Things I found." I caught Daniel's eye. His brows knit together, confusion and dread mingling. For years, George had been quiet, a man who avoided conflict. But now he looked different, determined. Emma squeezed my hand. "Mom," she whispered, "what else could there be?" I did not know, but the way George's gaze lingered on Margaret, I understood this was not the end. It was only the beginning of the final unraveling. Before I reveal what George found, let me ask, have you ever seen someone's power crumble in public, right when they thought they were untouchable? How did it feel to witness truth finally come to light? Share that in the comments, because those stories remind us that justice does arrive, even if delayed. And if you want to hear the final twist that none of us saw coming, subscribe right now. Because what George uncovered would change everything. Margaret had lost her grip, but George was about to deliver the final blow. George's words hung in the air like a warning bell. The crowd around us carried on with laughter and celebration, but for our family time seemed to slow. His eyes were fixed on Margaret, and for the first time in years, I saw him look at her, not as a husband blinded by loyalty, but as a man staring at a stranger. Later that evening, after the ceremony crowd dispersed, George asked us to meet at his house. Emma and I exchanged uneasy glances, but Daniel agreed. We drove in silence, the emerald gown folded carefully across Emma's lap like a banner of victory and resilience. Yet I knew what was coming next, could redefine everything we thought we knew about Margaret. Inside George's den, the air was heavy. He motioned for us to sit, then disappeared upstairs. When he returned, he carried a cardboard box, old and dusty, as if it had been hidden away for years. He placed it on the table and opened the lid slowly. Inside were fragments of Emma's past, things we had long thought lost. Broken sketchbooks, water-stained paintings, ribbons from art shows that had mysteriously vanished, even a small clay sculpture Emma had made in middle school, chipped and cracked. Each piece bore the mark of destruction. Emma gasped, covering her mouth. Those were mine," she whispered. George nodded grimly. I found them in the attic. She kept them all. His voice shook with disgust, like trophies. The room fell silent. The weight of years of sabotage now lay in front of us, undeniable. It was no longer just suspicion, no longer incidents that could be excused as misunderstandings. It was a collection of crimes against a child's joy, curated and hidden by the very woman who claimed to be family. Daniel's face turned pale as he stared into the box. His hands clenched into fists. She saved them. Why, his voice cracked. I swallowed hard, anger and grief colliding inside me. Because cruelty is not an accident, Daniel. It was never random. She wanted control. And keeping these, it meant reliving her power every time she looked at them. Margaret stood in the corner, silent, her mask finally slipping. Her lips trembled, but no excuse came. For once she could not twist the story. The evidence was laid bare. George's voice was low but firm. I am meeting with a lawyer. I cannot stay married to someone who would destroy her own granddaughter's spirit and then keep the proof like a collection. Daniel flinched, shock etched across his face. But he did not argue. His silence was its own agreement. Emma stepped forward, her hands hovering over the box, as if touching the fragments might reopen old wounds. Her voice was soft but steady. All these years I thought I was just unlucky, that maybe I was clumsy, forgetful, that I lost things or ruined them myself, but it was her. It was always her. Tears welled in my eyes as I pulled her close. It was never you, sweetheart. It was her cruelty. And now the truth is out. For the first time, Margaret looked small. Not fierce, not powerful, but small. The truth had stripped her of her armor. George's decision to seek a divorce was not just about ending a marriage. It was about reclaiming dignity, about drawing a line in the sand. I need to pause here. Have you ever uncovered evidence that confirmed every suspicion you had carried for years? Evidence that made you realize you were never crazy, never imagining it. If you have, write it in the comments because your story can help others trust their instincts. And subscribe, because the next part will show how the final confrontation tore away Margaret's last defense, and how Daniel, her son, finally chose once and for all where his loyalty belonged. The box on the table was not just filled with broken art supplies. It was filled with years of truth, and truth once revealed cannot be hidden again. The box sat between us like a silent witness, its broken ribbons and ruined sketches screaming louder than any accusation could. Daniel stared at it for a long time, his hands shaking. He had been caught in denial for so many years, trapped between loyalty to his mother and love for his daughter. But now, staring into that box, he could not escape the truth anymore. Finally he stood. His chair scraped harshly against the floor, the sound slicing through the silence. He turned to Margaret, his face pale but his eyes blazing. "Give me your house key," he said. His voice was low, controlled but unshakable. Margaret blinked, her mouth twitching. "Daniel, you cannot mean that. I am your mother." "Yes," he said, his jaw tightening. "You are my mother. And for years I excused you. I looked away, told myself you did not mean it. But this," he gestured to the box, "this is cruelty, not accidents, not quirks, cruelty. And I will not let you near my daughter again until you face what you have done." Emma stood beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. For the first time, she looked at her father not with disappointment, but with something like relief. He was finally standing tall, finally choosing her. Margaret's face twisted, anger flashing through her eyes. "She is not your real daughter," she snapped, her voice sharp and venomous. Daniel flinched as if struck. Then his voice rose louder than I had ever heard it. "She is more my family than you are right now." The words thundered in the room, and for a moment none of us moved. Margaret's face drained of color. George looked at her with disgust. And Emma, my sweet Emma, blinked back tears that were not from sadness, but from vindication. Margaret's hands trembled as she reached into her purse. The jingle of metal as she pulled out her keys was louder than any shout. Slowly she placed them in Daniel's open palm. It was the sound of power breaking, of years of control slipping away. Daniel's voice softened, but the steel remained. "You are not welcome in our home, not until you make this right, and maybe not ever." Margaret's lips trembled, her eyes darting between us, searching for a lifeline. but none came. Not from George, whose gaze was hard as stone, not from me, whose patience had long been exhausted, and not from Daniel, who had finally drawn a boundary she could not cross. Emma stepped forward, her voice calm, steady. You tried to erase me, but all you did was prove how strong I am. You lost Grandma. You lost everything. The words did not come from anger, but from strength. A declaration. A truth Margaret could not refute. She turned her shoulders rigid and walked out of the room. The slam of the door echoed through the house like the closing of a chapter. Daniel sank back into his chair, his face buried in his hands. I should have seen it sooner, he whispered. I should have protected you both. I placed my hand on his shoulder. You see it now. That is what matters. Emma leaned against him, her head resting lightly on his arm. You chose me today, Dad. That is enough. And it was. For years, Margaret had divided us, using Daniel's silence as her shield. But tonight that shield shattered. For the first time, our family stood together, whole, united, unbreakable. Let me pause here and ask you, have you ever drawn a line with someone you love, finally saying enough after years of silence? How did it feel to claim that boundary? Share it in the comments, because your strength could help someone else find theirs. And subscribe, because what happened next, the final twist from George, would make everything unravel even further. The house keys in Daniel's hand were more than metal. They were proof that loyalty to cruelty had ended, and loyalty to love had begun. The silence after Margaret left was heavy, like the air right before a thunderstorm. Daniel sat with his face buried in his hands. Emma leaned against him, and I held my breath, waiting for what George would say next. He had been so quiet through the confrontation, letting Daniel finally speak the words that needed to be said. But now, his eyes were fixed on the box of broken keepsakes, and there was something in his expression that unsettled me. He cleared his throat. There is more, he said. His voice was low but steady. I did not just find this box. I found an entire trunk in the attic, filled with things Margaret took from Emma over the years. Sketches torn in half, brushes snapped. Even a ribbon from her first art show cut down the middle. She hid them. She kept them. Emma's lips parted in shock. She saved all of it. George nodded, like trophies. His voice cracked with disgust. At first I thought maybe she was keeping them as reminders, but when I saw how each one was ruined, I knew. This was not nostalgia. This was cruelty. She wanted to keep proof of her power. Daniel's head snapped up. His face was pale, his eyes wide with disbelief. You mean she has been doing this for years, and you knew? George shook his head firmly. I did not know the full extent until I found that trunk. I suspected things over the years, but Margaret was skilled at covering her tracks. I see it now. I should have acted sooner. His gaze fell on Emma, softening. I am sorry, Emma. I failed you by staying silent. Emma swallowed hard. Her eyes glistened, but her voice was steady. It was not your silence that hurt the most. It was hers, the way she made me feel invisible. But thank you for seeing it now. George's jaw tightened. I am meeting with a lawyer. I cannot stay married to a woman who destroys her granddaughter's spirit and hides the evidence like trophies. That trunk, that box, they are evidence enough. Daniel stiffened, struggling to process it. You are divorcing her. Yes, George said without hesitation. Justice has to start somewhere. She has manipulated this family for too long. I will not let her do it any longer. The room grew still. Daniel's shoulders sagged as though decades of denial were finally collapsing. For so long he had believed his mother was incapable of this kind of malice. Now the proof was too heavy to ignore. Emma's voice broke the silence. So, she will not be able to hurt us anymore. I pulled her close. No, sweetheart, not again. We have the truth now, and truth is stronger than lies. George placed a hand on the box. We will hand this over to the lawyer, too. She cannot erase this. Not with excuses, not with manipulation. I looked at him, then really looked at him, and realized something important. For years, George had been Margaret's shadow, standing quietly behind her. But tonight he was stepping into the light. He was choosing honesty over loyalty, truth over pretense. And that shift, it meant everything. Later that night, as Emma hung her emerald gown carefully in her closet, she looked at me and whispered, Mom, it feels like the curse is finally breaking. I smiled, brushing her hair back from her face. It is not a curse, love. It was control, and now it is gone. But deep down, I knew Margaret would not disappear quietly. People like her rarely do. She would find another way to claw back control to spin her story. Yet this time we were ready, because no matter what she tried, the truth was no longer hidden. Let me pause here. Have you ever watched someone's carefully built facade crumble piece by piece until there was nothing left? How did it feel to finally see them for who they were? Share it in the comments because your story might help someone else see through their own storm. And do not forget to subscribe because the final chapter, our family's quiet victory, was about to unfold. The trunk in the attic had sealed Margaret's fate. But Emma's triumph in her emerald gown was the true ending she never saw coming. The days that followed felt lighter, as though the storm clouds that had hung over our family for years were finally beginning to part. Emma carried herself differently. She walked taller, laughed louder, and when she looked in the mirror at the emerald gown hanging in her closet, I could see pride in her eyes instead of pain. That dress had become more than fabric. It was proof that cruelty could not erase her worth. We went to her favorite diner that weekend, a little place with checkered floors and chrome stools that had been there since the 1950s. Emma slid into the booth, still wearing her gown. She refused to take it off until the celebration was complete. She laughed as she dipped fries into her milkshake, the beads on her dress glittering under the neon lights. For the first time in years, I saw her free of Margaret's shadow. Daniel reached across the table, his hand brushing mine. His eyes were tired but soft. "I am sorry," he said quietly. "I should have seen it all sooner. I let her get away with too much." Emma leaned over, resting her head on his shoulder. "You see it now, Dad. That is enough." Tears threatened my eyes. For so long, I had carried the weight alone, protecting Emma from Margaret's sabotage, trying to hold our family together. But now, Daniel was finally standing with us. We were no longer fractured. We were whole. That evening, our phones buzzed with a surprising notification. Margaret had posted a long apology on social media. She admitted to recent mistakes, announced she was stepping back from her church and community roles to reflect, and asked for prayers. Emma raised an eyebrow, sipping her milkshake. "Do you think she means it?" I laughed softly, not for a second. But she knows we have the truth. And she knows if she tries anything again, her image will unravel. Because the journal, the photos, even the boutique's security footage, they were all safely stored. Quiet weapons against future schemes. Margaret could not erase the truth anymore. 2 days later, George called. His voice was heavy, tinged with both sadness and relief. "I found more in the attic," he confessed. A box full of broken supplies, torn sketches, even the ribbon from Emma's first art show. She kept them like souvenirs. "I am meeting with a lawyer tomorrow to move forward with the divorce." I closed my eyes, gripping the phone tightly. Justice does not always arrive with trumpets and banners. Sometimes it comes quietly through steady steps, undeniable evidence, and the courage to finally say enough. George was choosing truth over pretense, and in doing so, he was breaking free too. When I hung up, I looked at Emma, who was humming as she hung her gown carefully back in her closet. The emerald fabric caught the light glowing softly. I thought about what it meant. It was not just a dress. It was a shield, a symbol, a declaration that no matter how many times Margaret tried to dim her light, Emma would only shine brighter. For years, Margaret had tried to control us through sabotage and silence. But in the end, all she had done was teach us how to stand taller, how to plan smarter, and how to rise above cruelty with grace. And that perhaps was the greatest victory of all. Ari, before we close this chapter, I want to ask you, have you ever turned someone's attempt to break you into the very fuel that made you stronger? If so, share it in the comments. Your story could remind someone else that resilience is always possible. And if you found hope in this journey, subscribe now, because there is another story waiting, one where strength and truth shine just as brightly. The gown was no longer simply a creation of fabric and thread. It was proof that love once tested can transform into unshakable power. And Emma, standing in it beneath the lights, had shown the world and her grandmother that she was unbreakable. When the noise of the ceremony faded and the shadows of Margaret's cruelty finally retreated, what remained was quiet. Not silence born of fear, but peace, earned through truth. Emma's laughter filled our home again. Daniel no longer looked away when difficult conversations rose. And I, for the first time in years, could breathe without the weight of waiting for the next blow. In the weeks that followed, life returned to its rhythm. School ended, summer arrived, and Emma spent her afternoons sketching by the window, sunlight pooling around her. But there was a difference now. She no longer doubted herself. She no longer questioned whether she belonged. The emerald gown hung in her closet as a constant reminder she was more than the sum of what others tried to take from her. George moved forward with the divorce. His decision was not made from bitterness, but from clarity. He had lived too long in shadows and chose instead to walk in truth. For Emma, it was another sign that justice, though slow, does come. And Margaret, she faded her power, unraveling not with a single explosion, but with the steady erosion of trust. She had tried for years to control the story. But once Emma spoke, once the evidence was laid bare, her voice lost its hold. Looking back, I see the emerald gown for what it really was. Not just fabric, not just a mother's precaution, but a symbol of resilience. It proved that no matter how many times cruelty tries to cut us down, love has the power to weave something stronger, something brighter, and that is what I want you to carry with you. Whatever you face, whatever storms come, remember your light cannot be stolen. It can only be hidden for a time, waiting for the moment to shine again.